Good morning, everyone. I am Deeksha, and on behalf of the WinP team, a very warm welcome to all of you. We are glad you are here. Thank you for taking the time today. For those who are new to WinP, let me briefly share a little about who we are and the mission that drives us. WinP is a not-for-profit platform focused on bringing more women into investing as investor, capital allocators, and industry leaders. We work with PEVC firms to turn diversity goals into meaningful actions. When we launched in 2022, firms often said we want to hire, but we can't find them. So, what became very clear very quickly was that the talent had always been there. The real challenge was creating clearer, more accessible pathways into the industry. That's exactly why WinP exists, to make those pathways more accessible for ambitious women ready to build careers in private equity markets. WinP Ignite is a key part of that mission. Through career sessions, masterclass, job opportunities, and a profile bank where women can share their profiles and member can connect with them directly through a private anonymized platform. If you haven't joined the WinP Career Network yet, I highly encourage you to do so. The link is in the chat. And today's workshop is a perfect example of what Ignite is all about. Real practical conversation with professionals who have successfully navigated this industry. Now, let me introduce you to our facilitator, Parita. Parita Asher, CFA, is a principal with OGIF and has been the investment manager since 2017. She has more than 14 years of experience across private equity investing and equity research. She managed investments in Annapurna Finance, Capital Small Finance Bank, PNB MetLife, and Homelane, and has full cycle experience from investments to exist. Involved in delivering successful IPO of Capital Small Finance Bank and secondary exits in Annapurna Finance and PNB MetLife. Prior to joining OGIF, she has worked at research desk of the Institutional Equities Division of Ambit Capital. She was responsible for leading research on key listed companies in the sectors of cement, metal, and mining and aviation, and has also covered telecom and media sectors in the past. Her research and recommendations have been on long-term competitive advantages of companies with strong focus on accounting and corporate governance. Parita is a CFA and a chartered accountant. And now to our moderator, Pratiti Das Gupta, a private market and infrastructure finance professional with experience across project finance, capital raising, and investment analysis spanning India, Southeast Asia, and Europe, a WinP ambassador and part of the community since 2021. She is deeply committed to advancing diversity in this industry. Now, over to you, Parita.
Hi Diksha. Hi Parita. Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Diksha. Hello everyone. Welcome to the session. So, a few things, just a few house rules before we begin. This workshop is being recorded, and the edited version will be shared with you afterwards. So, please drop your name and role in the chat. Good to know who is in the room. Third, share your questions anytime. I will be taking them through the session or during Q&A as the session progresses. If your name is not in our registration, in our registration folder, then we may need to remove you from the session. So please ensure that you're registered from the session. And if you're sharing with someone, please ask them to register as well. And once we wrap up, do connect with our facilitator Parita Asher and with me and the other team members on LinkedIn. Often the most valuable conversations continue with well beyond sessions like this. And the last thing that I would like to say is that we will be sharing a virtual a virtual card with you all after this session. So please stay tuned for that, wherein we will be sharing a kind of a repository of things. Now on to you, Parita, for the session. And yeah.
Thank you, Pratiti. Hello, and a very good morning to all of you. Thank you, Diksha and Pratiti, for the warm introduction. And a big thank you to Nupur, Diksha, Tina, and the entire team at WinP for conceptualizing this session. It's an absolute pleasure for me to discuss on a topic which is actually one of my favorites at work, financial modeling. I've been building financial models for about 15 years now. And even today, the thrill that I get out of evaluating a new business and linking everything that I've heard from the founder into the financial business model, and then thereafter trying to get to investment outcomes and decisions is the part of my job that I enjoy the most. I hope I can pass some of my love for financial modeling to everybody on the call today. And I really look forward to making this a very interactive session where we all exchange ideas, discuss all our real life experiences, and learn from each other. Before we discuss anything about what a financial model is, maybe we should start with an example. I'll just share my screen and we'll take it from there. So here, is my screen visible?
Yes, Parita, it is.
Okay. So let's start with a little poll. Let's imagine we're looking to invest in a company. We want to evaluate two founders. So what is founder A telling us? Founder A is telling us that she will build the India's largest coffee chain. She believes the Indian cafe market is at an inflection point, and their brand is uniquely positioned to capture this opportunity. Their ambition is to redefine the cafe experience in the country and become a household name. Now, against this, the other day, next day, we also meet founder B. What is founder B's pitch to us? She says that she'll set up 20 stores over the next 2 years and 200 in the next 5 years. She says that she expects to have 250 customers per store each day. She says the average bill value will be 250. Then she has an estimate of what the revenue is likely to be. Procurement costs for her will reduce over a period of time because she believes that as she scales, gross margins will start to improve. Thereafter, there will also be improvement in EBITDA margins because stores break even after 1 year, and then stores get achieve full maturity in 2 years. So this is how founder B pitches the idea to us. Now, if we had to invest today, let's see which founder we'll choose. So I think all of us can maybe vote on this. Yeah. So wonderful. Most of us have voted founder B. Why did we do that? We did not do it because it was necessarily a better business model. Do we know what founder A's business model was? Do we know whether returns would have been more attractive in founder A's case versus founder B? No, we do not know. But what we know is that founder B was able to articulate the story in terms of numbers for us to be able to make a business case out of it and then evaluate whether the returns of that business case make sense or do not make sense. So I think the broader point of having diligent financial modeling is to ensure that we're not just relying on a vision, but we've broken it down into measurable assumptions. This is exactly what a financial model is all about. It is the process of translating business assumptions in financial projections. Now, I want to look at the lens of both founders and investors when we are talking about financial modeling. I know from a session point of view, we've thought about this as financial modeling for investment decisions, which is the more popular reason or use case for financial models. But I want to just step back and also highlight why it is a very critical part of how founders or promoters should think about their business. I'm sure all of us have heard this many times from our founders. There is just so much demand. My sales are growing 40-50% year on year. Why do I need a 5-year plan? My product is so good or my service is so good that anyways, there is enough demand. Now we at OGIF, we insist that even after our investment, irrespective of whether the company is likely to raise capital over the next 3-4 years, irrespective, we ensure that all our portfolio companies have at least 5-year business plans on a rolling basis. Why do we do that, right? We think that it helps us think through the opportunities and risks of a business from a slightly more longer term perspective. Founders can get really busy with operational aspects, execution requirements, and maybe somewhere not plan adequately for the next 3, 4, 5 years. So, from a founder's lens, I think it does two things. First of all, it puts the overall vision in a measurable target. Second, what it does, it helps you plan for future. And when we say plan for future, these are very simple things, right? So, for example, today the company is selling 2 products. We think that today where the company is, and we are seeing continuously 40-50% growth in the company. Then why do we need to think beyond that? Because we're all, as a founder, the founder will be all trying to just ensure that that is achieved well. But if we don't do a financial model, what we could miss is that 3 years later, maybe we will have so much market share in that product that from there on growth is going to slow down. And at that point in time, how are we prepared to ensure that we have something else to offer to our customers, which then adds to the growth that our base product is going to offer? So if the base product growth becomes 10-15%, then invested in R&D 3 years before that to ensure that we have something else which will complement the growth and take it from a 10-15% to back to a 25-30-35%. So that's one aspect. Another use case could be solve for capital early on. We've all had so many instances where companies have reached situations where cash is left only for a few months and then we are in difficult times. Of course, it's the hardest thing to do when the company is already in a difficult situation and then trying to raise capital. It's going to be the most expensive, and we may also be risking the future of the company in case that capital is not raised. What financial modeling can help us solve is, if there are requirements in the business is growing 40-50%, there are investments required in working capital and capex. If we plan for this to see that 2 years later, so and so will be my working capital, so and so will be my capex, and do I have adequate funds to meet these numbers? If not, should I raise a little early on such that at that point in time, in case things don't work out, I would be better prepared? So financial modeling helps all of us think deeper. And I think we should all propagate doing this for all businesses, and founders also should do it a lot more than they do today. Moving on to an investor lens, right? So maybe on the investor side also, we could do a quick poll. So from an investor lens, let's say we get a spreadsheet. What I've tried to do is I've put in a coffee chain example for our entire conversation. It'll just help all of us contextualize things while we go about this workshop. So this is a example that we have. In the spreadsheet, what we got to know is it's going to make a 25% IRR. Now, what are we going to react to that? Excuse me. Is 25% IRR good? Should we invest? It's good, but we want to know the assumptions. We're not sure whether 25 is good or not good. And maybe it doesn't tell us much. How would each of us react to this? Yeah. Should we end the poll?
Yes, Parita. Oh, Pariti. Parita, is it visible to you, the results?
Yes, the results are visible to me.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if people were still voting. So we're good. We've ended the poll. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So B, C, D, actually all three are correct. And all three reactions are very fair, right? The basic premise of why we cannot comment on whether 25% is good or no is because we need to understand what the 25% means. So there are three main things from an investor lens that I typically look at when I look at a financial model or a business deal opportunity. Firstly, what is my base case IRR? And what is that base case IRR based upon? So let's say the founder says that he wants to open 20 stores. How much money do we need to open 20 stores? How profitable are those going to be? So as an investor, what return you will potentially earn will be a function of how the business will do. Now, when a founder says that the business is going to give you so and so return, it is our job to first understand that is based on what assumptions, and then put on our lens to first evaluate whether that is something that is reasonable, realistic, optimistic, conservative. And we've seen this. Sometimes founders are very conservative, sometimes they're very optimistic, sometimes they're actually very realistic. So we need to assess whether what the founder thinks is actually deliverable or it is a little difficult. Second and more important than the base case is actually the scenarios that we're playing with. Now we all know that life is going to be dynamic. It is going to be dynamic for the investor. It is dynamic for the founder. So if the founder says I'll be able to do X, it need not necessarily be X. But our job is to then test these assumptions to see what are the range of possibilities and outcomes that can come. So for example, when the founder says that I will be able to open 20 stores in, say, 2 years, we have to assess whether he can actually open 10 stores, he can open 18 at least, or he can actually open 22 stores or actually do 30 stores. Second, more important range is the margin range that we think about. So when the founder says that it'll be the business will be break even in the first year. Now, what is our range? Is it that it can be break even in 6 months? Is it that it can be break even on day one? Or is it that it will take at least 11 months to break even? Can this move from 1 year to 14 months to maybe never? Depending on the range of the answer that we get, is how we should think about the risk of a business. And unless we put it in the form of numbers, it becomes really hard to contextualize whether a certain investment makes sense and what is the right price for that investment. Third thing that financial models help investors with is to compare two deals which could be very different in nature and may inherently, the metrics of each business may not be comparable, but the outcomes in the form of returns for an investor and the risk attached could be compared, and then one could think whether I want to invest in X or Y. Just for an example. Now, earlier we started with an example where we had two coffee chain businesses, right? Those are relatively easier to compare with each other because we know the metrics are the same, right? How many stores, what is your average walk-in per customer, what is your bill per customer, etc. But say tomorrow you're comparing a software business. You have two transactions that you're evaluating. One is a software business. The second is a coffee chain business. Now, how do we compare the two? Because the financial models are very different, the assumptions, your entire build-up, everything is very different. So then the only way for us to compare is to see what is the range of return in the coffee chain that we can make, what is the range of return that we can make in the software business, and between the two, as an investor, what are you better placed investing at? If you are slightly an early stage investor where you are slightly your ability to take risk is a little higher, then maybe you may want a slightly wider range of risk return, such that there is an ability to capitalize if the company does very well. However, if you are a slightly late stage investor, then you might want to invest in a business which has narrower range of outcomes, and then accordingly ensure that the risk and return is better managed. So if we are diligent about the financial modeling and have thought this through, we can also evaluate two very different businesses and see which one is better for us. So I think maybe we should now think about key components of how a model is built. These are some basics. We will just go through these so that we're able to think through when we're actually evaluating a deal as to how deep do we want to go in a financial model. The sky is the limit when you're trying to build a financial model. So it can be very intimidating. It can be a one-page model. It all depends on what stage of investor you are and what is your conviction on a certain asset. So maybe we'll continue with the coffee chain example and see how we should build the business financial model basis the understanding that we have from the founder. Now, when we think of building a business model, what is the first thing that comes to our mind? The first thing that comes to our mind is that we should be doing a revenue buildup, because that's the base for everything else. But revenue build-up also, it can't be that, because the founder is saying that I'm going to achieve 100 crores revenue in year one, to 150 crores in year two, and 200 crores in year three. That's not how we should think about it. We should think about what it takes to build that revenue and whether that is achievable or not achievable. So in the coffee chain example, maybe how I would think about the revenue business case is what I've tried to put it together. Hopefully it's useful to think, and then we can then think about any other example using some of these basics. So in the coffee chain, how we'll build the revenue? We will do customers per store, because depending on how many people come up to the store will define what gets sold. Then what is their average bill value? And the third most important factor is how many stores are we operating with. So when we think about customers per store, what all things could we think about when we're building the financial model, right? Because somebody could say that, okay, I'm going to have 200 people walk into my store every day. Now it's our job to think whether it is possible or not possible. How do we think about these things? So firstly, what is your target addressable market, right? This could be things like which city you are in. So for example, you're in a tier 3 town in India. India has historically been a tea drinking country. Whether there will be enough population who will be drinking coffee, maybe it should be thought about. However, if you're trying to open an outlet in a metro city, then today coffee is a lot more popular in metros. So then the numbers could look very different. What is the age group that you're targeting? What is the income profile that you're targeting? What is the lifestyle of the person that you're targeting? What are their tastes and preferences? Then store location. That within once you've decided that, okay, my model is going to be that I'm going to go into metros, or my model is going to be that in metros there is a lot of competition. Let me go to tier 3 and tier 4, where I will be the first mover to bring coffee to that city, and whether I can make it capitalize on that opportunity. Now, once we decide what is the geography that we want to target, then we need to think about the location of the store. Now, the location of the store will define how many people walk into the store, right? And what is then the price point that you should be offering. So, for example, if you're opening a store in a corporate park, but inside the corporate park, there is a mall, and you're somewhere inside the mall, it is going to be very hard for you to get somebody to come and buy coffee, because somebody who's working in a corporate has coffee machines within their office. So for them to come there to drink coffee, your footfall actually, I would think, is going to be much lower. Against this, if there is within a corporate park, if there's a building and then you're putting up a kiosk within the building, then everybody who's getting into office and going out of office will be your target customer. So one should think about what the location is going to be. Similarly, say you are trying to target a vicinity where there are a lot of colleges, right? So then you need to think about that. What is the price point? I can't offer a very premium offering to that audience. A few other drivers which decide customer per store could be what time of the hour are you operational. So everybody wants to drink coffee in the morning, in the afternoon. Suppose you're opening only at 11 o'clock. Doesn't help. All restaurants open at 11 o'clock, but a coffee shop cannot open at 11 o'clock. So stuff like that. What are your peak hours, and whether you are available when your customers are looking for that offering. Then things like sales channel. Of course, there will be a coffee on the go, whether you're offering a dine-in. Then you could also attract some of the working professionals who are looking for a breakfast plus coffee kind of a combination. Are you offering alongside a delivery model? What it does, if you complement your existing store with a delivery option, then what it could do is that within earlier you were not able to cater to a customer who was a corporate customer because your store is in a mall and he's not going to walk all the way. However, now if you have the delivery option, you may be able to tap in that customer because the coffee can be delivered to the table. And it of course helps in terms of leveraging operating OPEX once you have a wider set of audience. So that's a few things about customer per store. How would we think about average bill value? We could also simply say that coffee in India, it ranges anywhere between 100 rupees to 300 rupees. Maybe 200 is the sweet spot. Instead of that, we could also be a lot more detailed about it. wherein we could see that whether, depending on whether we are trying to cater to a college diaspora, or whether it is a corporate corporate TAM that we are looking to target. Depending on that, should be the pricing, should be the quality, should be the quantity that we are offering within the coffee. Whether we should do coffee plus dessert, whether we should do coffee plus snack. Then also different kinds of offerings in terms of whether you're offering sandwiches, what is the quality, what are the different things that you're trying to complement with it. You could also think of merchandise. So if you say this is in a vicinity where there are a lot of colleges, you could complement it with smaller goodies, like you could also sell planners. You could also sell smaller gifting items, t-shirts, stuff like that, which can all complement the existing offering. Make it slightly more differentiated in terms of your offering versus another coffee shop, and could increase your footfalls and your average bill per store. The third one is number of stores. Now, of course, we've thought about whether we want to, what is the addressable target addressable group that we are looking to capitalize on. So we should think about whether this is replicable across the cities. So, for example, if if we're looking to target college goers, right? Then there will be very 4 or 5 specific pockets in a city, and only there is where we can have stores, because our price points, our offerings are such. Then we can't think that, okay, in a city every city we will have 30 stores. That may not be feasible. Although the founder may have thought that, okay, I will enter into 20 cities, done a simple thing, 20 into 30 stores per city, I will get to 600 stores. We have to validate whether all of this is possible. So these are some simple examples of how we typically do think of the revenue build-up, and it of course depends case to case. The next most important thing beyond the revenue build-up is the cost structure and margins. Of course, cost structure is really the essence of doing any business. Whether you will be able to make money out of it is the only reason why either you are raising capital or somebody else is investing in that business. And in cost structure, generally, what we've seen is that in real life, most financial models actually just extrapolate the situation today. So if today I'm sitting at a 50% gross margin, more often than not, the business model will say over a period of time, because of scale, the company will move from a 50% gross margin to a 55% gross margin. Now, our job as an investor is to think whether it will go from 50 to 55 or 50 to 60, or it can go from 50 to 45. And we've seen this in numerous examples in our investing journey, that the hardest thing to do is to achieve gross margin expansion. So whether that is possible, not possible, if you can you complement it. For example, I gave the example of selling merchandise alongside coffee, right? So somebody is buying a 200 rupee coffee, but if you can complement it with a 500 rupee t-shirt for 20% of your customers, then the profit you make because of having a few t-shirts in the store could really complement the margins that you're making. So over a period of time, how does one think about continuously maintaining and improving margins is what financial models can help you think through. The other important point around gross margins is also commodity price fluctuation, less relevant in the coffee example. But say things we're in times where global supply chains are really feeling the pressure. Things raw material prices which are linked to commodities, which are linked to Brent, they've all gone up meaningfully. And what sensitivity that situation can have to your margins is what is very critical for a investment professional to analyze when they're looking at the business. So, for example, you are making an EBITDA margin of say 15%. But your sensitivity to Brent is 20%. So what could happen is that just because of change in raw material prices, your entire EBITDA could get wiped off. And this is something that is nobody's mistake. It is not something the founder could have done something about. It is not something that the investor could have done anything about. It is just the reality of the business. And when we're evaluating, we should take into account what sensitivities different cost items have, and what is our ability to deal with it. So if these prices go up structurally, yes, over a period of time, it should get passed on to the customer. But does the company have the ability to pass it on? Whether it can be passed on over a 1 month period or it will take a year, because then we will have to solve for cash flows for a year because margins won't be there to support. So these are the kind of things, nuances that we should think about when we're trying to build financial models, rather than just extrapolate current situations and assume that these are true for the future. Things like the thing where I have seen most founders or promoters underappreciate is operating leverage in a business. So what most people do is that they always think that revenue will go 5x, operating costs. Either founders think that some amazing operating leverage will play out at corporate costs, and it will suddenly become 1/5 of what it was, or sometimes they don't build in any operating leverage. So as an investor, we must think that if the corporate cost today is 20 rupees, when the business goes from 100 rupees revenue to a 500 rupees revenue, will this corporate cost become 20 rupees? Will stay 20 rupees? Will it become 25? Will it become 50? How will this change as revenues grow? Because that's how we will be able to predict profitability and inherently cash requirements 2 years out today. I think there are a few other things, but I could keep talking on every point for 10 minutes, but it's just some indicators, largely to help everybody think through how one must think of the financial model. The most important thing, I think, is the cash generation. So there was a poll that was conducted on the group. I think most of you did choose cash flow as the key metrics to do a stress test before making any investment. And all of you are absolutely right? Cash is really the litmus test of any business. If the company is profitable but is not able to throw cash, then the cash requirements and funding requirements of the business are very different from another business which is profitable but cash throwing. So that is inherently the most important metric that we all must look at. What is your cash conversion cycle? And profitability to cash conversion is generally dependent on two things. One is largely working capital, and second, then that being the resultant operating cash flow being available to then do capex in the business. In the coffee chain example, when we think about this, do we need to worry that, I'm profitable, but I may not be generating cash? In the coffee chain example, we don't need to worry about that because the customer payments are upfront. So there are faster cash inflows. There are no debtors on the balance sheet. Inventory is not too much. You'll have a couple of days and hence your cash doesn't get tied up. Your supplier terms generally will be 30-45 days. So you are actually operating on a negative cash flow. The negative cash flow on the working capital side can be very, very meaningful when we're thinking about whether there will be future rounds of funding that the company will require and will result in dilution for an existing investor. Because as an existing investor or as an investor who's evaluating a deal, I just don't need to think about whether the next 2 years the company will be good enough with my capital. I need to think about my entire investment horizon. For us at OJIF, it's typically 5 years, 4 to 6 years rather. For other funds, it could be different. For family offices, it could be very different. And for each investor, depending on what their investment horizon is, They must think about what will be the cash flow requirements of the business. Will it be generated from internal cash flows, or will we require to raise external capital? If we do need to do it, then there will be dilution. So that needs to be taken into account when we're building the business returns, IRR, MOIC, etc. Just some examples of why we need capital, but I think they're quite self-explanatory. The most important part, and the part where we typically spend a lot of time at the fund doing, right? So now, if you can just see this table that is there. So this is a scenario. So let's say our coffee chain. Now we're thinking about how the returns of that business will be. And this is the table that somebody has drawn at the fund. So what that person is saying is that revenue could be in the range of 800 to 1200 crores, and EBITDA margin could be in the range of 8 to 24%. Now, anybody who's underwriting this business needs to first have a base case. So let's say my base case is that the revenue will be 1100 crores and the margin will be 20%. Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to make in the base case a 29% IRR. A 29% IRR is a fairly healthy IRR, so I think we should all go ahead with the investment. However, what is more important than the base case is the sensitivity of the base case. By sensitivity and scenario analysis, what we do is we try to think what could be the range of outcomes that we could be staring at 5 years out. And depending on that range of outcome is when we should think whether it makes sense, doesn't make sense at a particular price. And if it doesn't make sense at a particular price, then what is the price I can offer? Let me just put it in the form of numbers so that there is better relatability. So let's say our base case is 1100 crores revenue, 20% margin. So this is 29%. Good, sounds good. Now, if I believe doing the various scenarios and assumptions that I've done in the financial model to say that in the worst case, my revenue is going to be 900 crores. And the worst case, my margin will be 16%. So then what is the IRR in the worst case? I'm thinking it will be 18%. And a good case, let's say I think it will best go to a 1200, but margins won't go above 20%. So then my range is 18% to 31%. Now it's very important for one to think and absorb what this range is. Now, if I am a fund for which 18% return is not a good return, I will not be able to underwrite this asset then at the price at which it is being offered. So then I have two choices. I will either say that this we pass the deal. Second option is to say that it doesn't make sense for me at this valuation. I will rather offer X value, X minus 10%, X minus 20% as valuation, such that my return is protected at the time of exit. Now, when we're evaluating two opportunities, one against the other, at that point in time, we should think. So let's say two opportunities, both of them are giving us a 29% IRR. But in one case, the range of opportunity is all the way from a 15% to a 45%. But in company B, the range of returns that I am looking at is a narrower range, let's say 25% to 35%. Then what it means is that the risk in asset A is much higher than the risk in asset B. And depending on whether I want to play a high risk game or a low risk game, I will decide which company to invest in. The base case is important, but what is even more important, I would think, is what is my range of returns that I'm looking at. And there are a few tools that that generally come handy. These are two variable data tables, what if analysis, scenario analysis in Excel. which do help us get some of these outcomes quickly rather than continuously trying to change assumptions in the model. So I think to summarize, what I would think is that financial models do not predict one outcome. They help investors understand how changes in assumptions influence risk, expected returns, and investment decisions. There are a few examples that we wanted to run through. Diksha, Praditi, how are we doing on time? Can we do the 2 examples or should we open the Q&A?
Parita, maybe we can do the 2 examples and then accordingly the Q&A. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm okay if this takes another 10-15 minutes, if the audience is also okay.
Yeah, sure.
That's fine.
Okay. Diksha, do you mind putting up the, I think there's one last poll that we have. Oh, no, the second, the one which is the chemical company example.
Sure.
Okay, I think maybe 1 minute, sorry. It has not come up. Maybe Diksha, I missed sending you the text.
No worries. No worries.
Okay, I will maybe just give a voiceover. Okay, so
Sure.
we are in an industry where the industry is going through a downturn. So this is a chemicals company that we are evaluating. So demand has slowed down. Chemical prices have softened. Margins are under pressure, and the overall sentiment around the sector is very weak. What would we do as investors? Would we invest in that opportunity or look at that opportunity as an attractive opportunity for us to invest? I think is the question. Maybe I'll just repeat it because it was a voiceover. I'm not sure if I was very articulate. Imagine that you're an investment analyst at a private equity fund. You're evaluating a potential investment in a cyclical business, which is a chemicals company. The industry is going through a downturn. Demand has slowed down. Chemical prices have softened. Margins are under pressure. And overall investor sentiment around the industry is very weak. Would we look at this opportunity for an investment? Yeah, maybe in the interest of time, I'll just move to the discussion. Diksha, I'm not sure this is your screen. Something is flashing on the screen.
Yes, I just tried to put that.
Okay. You want to stop presenting? I'll go to the example.
Sure, I have just stopped it. Parita, you may share your screen.
Okay. Is it visible? Is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I think we got a lot of interesting answers on the chat, and a lot of you are very right about it. So let's look at this example, right? So we have numbers for FY26, wherein the revenue was 10,000, margin was 14%, and EBITDA was 1,400. we're looking at FY26, FY27, which is the current year, is going to be a down cycle. Revenues are going to be declining, margins are going to be declining, and EBITDA is going to also decline. We're in the down cycle. So now if we look at returns between FY26 and FY27, then assuming I've just kept the EV EBITDA constant for the purposes of this discussion. I'll get into the details of that later. But largely what we see is that enterprise value of the business between FY26 and FY27 is likely to decline. It'll go down from 11,200 to 7,200. So it apparently doesn't look very interesting from a near-term perspective. But let's see how this is likely to play out. What will happen over a period of time? And it happens in all cyclical businesses. Eventually, there is a phase of recovery. In the recovery phase, what happens is that because of the down cycle that some of the companies went through, some of them may announce capacity shutdowns, some of them may reduce their own supply that is available in the market, and eventually supply will adjust itself such that demand supply match each other. When that happens is when the recovery begins in that sector. So in FY28, that is one such year where we're seeing revenues normalize because pricing improves. EBITDA margins go up again from the 10% to the 13%. EBITDA comes back to where it was in FY26. And then we're still at a similar enterprise value for the business, which means we didn't make money, we didn't lose money, but we lost time, right? Now, what's important is that we do not shy away from looking at such opportunities. Of course, depending on every fund's thesis and your own risk return metrics. But just purely from an investment perspective, one must look at two things. One is, what is your horizon? If your horizon is not 2 years, but your horizon is 5 years or 6 years, then we should think through this entire period to think whether it makes sense to do today. So now, if let's say my investment horizon is 5 years, what I'll do is think about how the recovery, the expansion, and the peak of this business will play out. So FY28 was a recovery year. Things went back to regular levels. Then FY29, what happens is that because there was so much supply correction, when demand improves gradually, there comes a supply deficit. So at that point in time, we see further improvement in margins because prices go up further, supply is less than demand. And then the year after that, FY30 is the peak year. In that year, what happens is that demand is through the roof and supply improvements are still at capex level and have not started flowing into the market in terms of actual availability of raw material. At that point in time, just before we see the next wave of supply coming into the market is when the industry will be in its peak. If I were an investor, what I would think is that, can I enter at a down cycle and can I exit at peak? And if I'm able to balance this, then my returns could be really disproportionate relative to any other business where there is no cyclicality. Of course, cyclical businesses are not for all funds because, there is a mortality risk in those businesses. But as long as we as investors are able to evaluate what is the range of outcomes possible, and if it does fit, then even difficult times can give very interesting investment opportunities. I think that's what we wanted to rightly bring out as part of this example. There is one nuance I wanted to bring about when we're discussing this example, right? So here what we've largely looked at is that the IRR moves from a minus 36% to a plus 29% in a period of as short as 4 years. And that, of course, is coming largely because of how revenue and margins are moving. But what could really amplify this is the multiples that that business carries. So in this example, just to ensure that, we're purely talking about financials here, we linked the enterprise value only to the EBITDA that the company was making and kept the EV/EBITDA multiple constant at 8 times. However, what will actually happen, and we've seen across cycles, I've seen this play out. in down cycles, when the EBITDA goes down, ideally, in an ideal world, the EV EBITDA should go up because you're at the down cycle and your EBITDA is not a normalized EBITDA. However, in reality, what happens is that because of lack of interest and investment sentiment in that sector, EV EBITDA multiples also fall. So there is a double whammy in terms of what happens to enterprise value. So ideally, how this will play out is FY26, let's say in normalized times, we were at 8 times. In FY27, more often than not, what will happen is this 8 times will become a 7 times, 6 times. So the negative impact on enterprise value is that much more. So if I was an investor, I'll actually capitalize on that and ensure that at the time of entry, my entry valuation is even lower. And then at my exit at the peak, what will actually happen is that when you are at peak margins, ideally investors should be paying you a smaller EV EBITDA multiple because these margins are not sustainable. More often than not, actually investors, because they get suddenly so excited because of the supernormal margins that are there, they actually are willing in reality to pay a higher EV EBITDA multiple. Now, if I'm a smart investor, what I'll do is I will capitalize on this irrationality around multiples and enter at a lower EV EBITDA multiple in a down cycle and exit at a higher margin and higher EV EBITDA multiple in the peak of the cycle, in which case my IRR could be much higher than what a 29% is reflected currently in this table. This is an example of how cycles play out, and this is a chemicals company which is traditionally thought to be cyclical, and I just kept it like that to make it simple, but this is very valid today across different businesses, especially the ones which are in difficult times because of cash burn or have not achieved EBITDA break even. Even in those cases, what we've often seen is that when EBITDA margins have not reached normalcy, at that point in time, valuations are more subtle. And then thereafter, valuations go through the roof as soon as break-even is achieved. As an investor, I think a smart investor should be able to use the financial model to see this through and predict whether this is going to be break-even soon and whether I can capitalize on the valuation growth that will happen over the next 2 years. I just have one small example. I'll move to that. Diksha, can you put up the last question?
Sure, Parita.
Okay, Diksha, again, I think it's not showing the table.
Okay, you want me to show the table? Just give me a minute, I'll showcase the table.
Yeah.
Parita, is it visible?
Actually, not to me.
Yeah, it's visible to me. It's visible
Okay.
to me, yeah.
Okay.
Maybe there's some lag on your end, Parita.
No worries. So I think I'll just give a voiceover parallelly. So we have two business models that we hear about from two different founders, right? One founder says that I will do a company operated company. So let's go back to the coffee chain example where we're looking to expand stores. Okay. Founder A says that I will do only a cocoa model and I will have higher EBITDA margins. Founder B says that I will do a FOCO model. I will have lower EBITDA margins. So is this information enough for us to say whether COCO is better or FOCO? Unfortunately, no, because EBITDA margins need to be seen in the context of ROIC. And I will just explain how we should typically think of it. So let's say I'll just quickly run you through this. So, in the COCO model, revenue is 100 crores. In the FOCO model, revenue is 88 crores. EBITDA margin in the COCO model is 20%. EBITDA margin is the FOCO model is 9%. If we had only so much information, obviously 20 looks better than 9. However, if I were to analyze this, I think the 9% is better, because in the 20%, all the capex and all the investment around inventory in the store is coming from the company, whereas in the FOCO business, it is actually coming from the franchisee. What it means is that from an EBITDA for invested capital, the COCO model is offering only a 22% EBITDA, whereas the FOCO model is actually offering an 80% return on my money. So if I go for the FOCO model, my optical revenue may be smaller than the COCO model. My optical EBITDA margin will be less than what it will be in the FOCO model. However, what I will be able to do is, with the same capital, have a much wider range of stores that I could do. And as a result, from a total EBITDA perspective, I will be able to make much more EBITDA. And I will also have lesser cash requirement. All these are very real life scenarios. So in so many cases, we see deals where some are on COCO, some are on FOCO, some are on a blend. In existing portfolio companies, where the company, every time it thinks of rolling out a store expansion strategy, it needs to think through whether it needs to do COCO, FOCO. So all I'm trying to say with this messaging is that, one, we should not just look at revenue, EBITDA, or the P&L. The P&L needs to be seen in sync with working capital and the cash requirements to achieve that P&L. And then is when we can see whether one is better than the other. So this was a small example that I wanted to just share to also bring about how the financial model and all aspects of it, be it balance sheet, be it capex, be it business model or P&L, talk to each other to eventually give us investment outcomes. And also generally, today, most investors actually prefer business models which are lower on capex or cash requirements and are asset light. So generally, just from a valuation perspective also, what we've seen is that FOCO models which are more asset light are seeing more and more investor interest and are more popular and more liked by investors rather than very asset heavy models. Just a small ending from my side, and then we can open the floor for Q&A. What I wanted to mention, and I've always thought about it since the time I was an analyst. So before doing private equity, I was an equity research analyst at Ambit Capital. So I was actually the first independent analyst to write research on the new age aviation sector, which is after Indigo got listed. Actually, I wrote the first report on Indigo. Before that, there was only Jet, and then there wasn't really any investor interest in that stock. So I was the first analyst to write on Indigo as a company. So Indigo had this very unique business model wherein it had no planes on its balance sheet. So the entire balance sheet was very, very light. And it was almost like, you could add as many planes as you could without having any cash requirement because it was entirely an OPEX model. So obviously investors thought it was a great way to scale up and all of that. But what should be the multiple that should be given to such a model? Because nobody had seen this kind of a model earlier. So one very senior fund manager in the country in a very large mutual fund discussed this with me once. That consumer companies, why do people love consumer companies or give them high valuations, right? Two, three things that work very well. Capex requirements are very low, so investors don't need to worry about dilution. Second point, the demand is really, really, in a country like India, it's really hard to say that demand will ever peak. So longevity of growth is very high. Both these things are equally applicable in the case of Indigo, because when Indigo started, rather got listed, we all knew that aviation is just taking off in the country, and of course, capex requirements of the business were very low. So he said, "Oh, why should I give it a valuation multiple which is akin to say an asset-heavy business? I should give it a consumer multiple." And thankfully, I thought this through then. But the argument I made of why Indigo should not have got a consumer company multiple is because the margins of Indigo and its sensitivity to crude oil is very high, which is not there in a consumer company. So in a consumer company, if your raw material price goes up by 20%, it is not going to result in your margins becoming zero. But in Indigo, that can happen if you're not able to push that through. And how much you're able to push that through and what impact it will have on demand is always unknown. Largely from that day, I always think of financial modeling that it is not a science, it is an art as well. So the science really in modeling is that, we understand accounting concepts, we understand finance, we understand valuations, and then putting all of that together in an Excel that actually works and gives us the right result. But the art of it really lies in asking the right questions, understanding the business, and then ensuring that our assumptions are in sync with reality. Of course, reality will not play out the way we always thought. But we should all hope that our models are strong enough to give us a range of possibilities, and hopefully the actual outcome is within that range. So hopefully today's session has made us all of us a little more artistic than we were, at least on the financial modeling side. Thank you very much, and I'd love to go on with questions.
Thank you so much, Parita, for this wonderful session. And we all took away lots of takings from this session. So let's open the floor from the Q&A session. The first question that we have is from Neha. And Neha is asking, in your view, what would be a reasonable break-even period for a tea or coffee chain like Chayos?
Just a disclaimer, I'm not an investor in any tea business or coffee business, and that's particularly why I've picked up that example, because it should be. But my simple, see, whether what is right or what is wrong is not something I want to comment on, because different business models can mean very different things. What I am a big lover of short break-even times and high ROIC. So I don't measure companies' basis whether it is break-even in year 1 or year 2 or in 6 months. What I like to do is to say that my period should not be too long. Anything above 2 years is something that I'm very uncomfortable, because then we don't know. Until 2 years, we won't even know whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. And it'll be too late, I think, after 2 years, if we're burning money for 2 years and then we don't know, it may or may not pan out, right? So I have a lot of love for things where within 6 months to a year, we have visibility on whether it's working or not working. That's number one. And second, I think what we should broadly look at when we're evaluating is the inherent ROIC of the business rather than just margins. So this is how I will.
That's very insightful, Parita. The next question is from from Surekha. So, if the investment is done in tranches and the assumptions change prior to the second tranche, will the investment terms change?
Yes, they absolutely should change. Um, uh, Whenever we typically, as a fund, do not do multiple tranches. We just keep a small sum in case of any adversities that the company goes through. Whenever we've advised companies on this matter, what we've said is that what we should look at is always finalize terms for a certain tranche today, and then keep the second tranche and the third tranche open, depending on whether we're thinking that what is going to happen tomorrow is likely to be better than what we think, or worse than what we think. This will be the exact opposite for the founder. So, depending on whether you're wearing the founder hat or the investor hat, what you must ensure is hedge yourself against something which can go very wrong. So, if you do see that this is a very high risk business model, then you should definitely keep terms open. But if you see that you're fairly confident that even if it goes a little worse than what my case is, but the upside risk of something better playing out is much higher, then as an investor I would lock my terms, because otherwise the company is going to come and ask for more favorable terms than what it's offering you today. So depending on what side of the table you are and whether you see there is more upside risk or downside risk, you would accordingly think of that.
That absolutely makes sense, Parita. Just before we go on to the last three questions, I would request all of you to fill in the feedback poll that will be floated by Diksha, so that we can improve on our future sessions. So Diksha, will you be? Am I audible? Yeah. Okay. It's there. Mhm. So meanwhile, I think we can go on with the next question. So Parita, the last three questions are from myself. So I think I will kind of present it. So if we go on to the chemicals model that you presented, so the chemicals company model. So we saw that there was margin expansion from, I guess, FY 28 onwards, and probably it was from operating leverage as the capacity utilization improved. So my question is, what specific fixed cost line items would need to stay flat for that EBITDA margin jump to actually materialize?
Just on that, typically how it would work is that both would play out in an upcycle, especially in cyclical companies. You would get pricing benefits, which is very meaningful on EBITDA margins. Always price versus value. Price has a much larger impact on margins than volume has. The benefit of volume is usually more gradual. But from a capacity utilization perspective and an OPEX line item, I think larger things like, of course, corporate costs continue to remain what they are. And generally, we should all really look at the corporate cost line item to say that whether this is really corporate cost or there is some element of variable linkage to the revenue. Because of late, in at least the new age companies, what a lot of times we've seen is that it's actually in the line item of corporate cost, but it has a lot more linkage to revenue, and it is very linked to variable. It has a nature of variable cost more than fixed cost, which actually can sometimes really take our models for a toss. I think we should look at each and every cost item within the corporate cost to say whether it is management salaries, whether it is HR costs, whether it is corporate rent, etc. These things which ideally should not change. Second item, if it is a manufacturing company, then things at the factory end, which is factory rent, power costs to some extent. It has a combination of variable and fixed cost elements. So all of this need to be broken down rather than thinking whether it is factory cost or corporate cost. We should think about the nature of the cost and what is its linkage to whether it's variable or fixed. Sometimes it's a mix of two, and then accordingly build it in all our models.
Thank you. That answers a lot.
Yeah, just one more point, not related to the chemical example, but more in new age tech companies. What we've seen is that tech costs. So all founders say that I have a very strong, and I've already built out my tech team, and now I'll go 5x from here in terms of revenue, and my tech costs will not change. Never have I seen that happen. So we need to really spend time to understand what is the tech capability, what is the cost for, what are those folks sitting and doing, and whether that will change when revenue changes. More often than not, off late models have been going wrong because of this one line item.
That's interesting. And that answers my question, actually. So the last two questions I had, again, is from the chemical company. So basically, so you mentioned about the capacity shutdown of weaker competitors, say between FY 28 and 30. Say that doesn't happen, but, demand still recovers as forecasted due to other macro situations. So would the model break? I assume it would. So which line item in the model breaks first if it does? Say revenue, EBITDA, or exit multiple?
Margin will break first.
Margin
Because
will
what will it result into is that if capacities don't go out and supply doesn't correct, and demand, generally supply is a bit of a shock. It's
Yeah.
either too much or too little in capital heavy businesses, capex heavy businesses, but demand is more gradual. So the effect of demand always comes gradually. Supply shocks don't come in, then what happens is that pricing then does not go up to the extent that supply can take it to. In which case, margin gets significantly impacted. There might be some impact on revenue because there's more competition and more supply, so you'll be able to sell a little less than what you thought you will be able to. However, margins could be very different because of pricing.
Makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. I like the chemical example very much. So the last question is also from the chemicals, example. So you said that, I mean, I just saw on the table that, the IRR turns positive in FY 29, I think, after being negative in FY 27 and 28. So, from an investor's perspective, what would need to be true operationally, by end of FY 27 for you to have conviction that, 2 years of a negative return position? Yeah.
I should be seeing in of course this model when I'm thinking through, I'm thinking of two things to play out: demand to continue to grow, and second is supply to correct. I need these two things to happen for the model to play out. As we are evaluating this investment, we should try and build conviction around these two items, and then also try to quantify how much supply will go out. And what is the elasticity of price on what quantum of supply going out? These are all the basic economics that we learn: price elasticity of commodities, etc. So that needs to be thought about to say that if supply goes out by 10%, can it result in a 20% increase in price? And if that is the case, then you continuing to be there 2 years out will be very, very you could generate very, very high profitability because pricing is going to really go up, and then you'll be able to capitalize on margins. But for that, you will have to be able to live through the bad period of the next 1.5 years. And for that, you need to be capitalized, and the balance sheet needs to be strong enough to support that.
Got it, Parita. Got it. And next, we have another question actually from Neha. So, in your view, what are the most important factors to determine how much investment or fundraise amount will be meaningful in for a company at a particular stage?
Thanks, Neha, for that question. It's a very deep question, so I will try and give my best attempt at answering that. Firstly, I think it is very different from stage to stage. and it is very different from investor to investor. I'll think of the investor lens first because that comes more naturally to me. I will then I'll think of it from the founder's lens. So from the investor's lens, if I were an early stage investor, what I would think is that let me invest some small capital first, such that the company is able to as an early stage investor, you have certain milestones. I'm not an early stage investor, but whatever I understand of that journey is that you have milestones that you say that first, you need to see whether there is product market fit. Then you need to see whether you are able to actually execute this at a small scale in a particular city. You'll have certain milestones that you will think that this company needs to achieve. So how I would plan is that at least for the next two milestones, I would invest in the company such that we are not very short in terms of our vision and do not walk out of that opportunity or business post investment after a very short period of analyzing it and it not playing out. So I would think next two milestones I would invest for that, and then once it's actually working, once we see some success in those two milestones have been achieved, is then we again look at raising capital, because you don't also want to invest too much capital in a business and put too much capital at risk because the stage is different. From a mid stage to a late stage investor, where the fund that I represent, Oman India Joint Investment Fund, comes from, we typically plan for the next 4 to 5 years. What I do not want is that my exit outcome, largely we look at IPO as an exit outcome, and in some cases strategic. In that case, I don't want that my exit outcome, which is an IPO, is linked to whether the company is able to raise capital tomorrow or no. In which case, I will do two things. I will ensure that the company is adequately capitalized for the next 4 to 5 years and is able to execute the plan that we've thought about. Second thing that I will ensure is that I will have a backup plan in case it doesn't play out and there is a need for a small capital raise. So these two things I will solve for. But this is because I have an investment horizon in my mind, because my fund has a fund life and my fund horizon is 4 to 6 years. Against that, say if it was a slightly different investor who has more patient capital, likes of larger sovereign wealth funds, larger family offices, etc., who may be okay to live through an investment for 8 to 10 years. What they can also do is that invest capital, look at it for a next 2-3 year period, and also then look at investing again. So depending on what lens and what investment horizon you are at, you need to think about how much fundraise to happen, because the timing of the fundraise really defines how much dilution happens and what is your entry valuation. So it's a very delicate balance. And I think investment horizon is something that should be answered, and then how much capital should be raised. A little nuance on the founder side of things. If I were a founder, I would first think about what is my realistic break-even period and the period from which my company becomes self-sustaining. By self-sustaining, what I mean is that the existing cash flows of the business are good enough to fund my future growth. Let's say I see that period to be 5 years later. And I am today at some scale. I haven't raised capital. I'm bootstrapped. Let's say I'm at 100 crore revenue. I think at 1,000 crores revenue, I don't need further capital. I'll be able to fund my growth. So now I have to solve for this journey between 100 and 1,000. If I were to think of it, what I would do is that not solve for all of it today. Because if I solve for all of it today, I am diluting very early when I am at 100 crores, when I think that I will be 5x the scale in 5 years. So I would solve for it for the next 2 years. But when I'm solving for the next 2 years, what I will also ensure is that in these 2 years, I build it well such that I'm not worried that whether I will be able to raise capital after 2 years. So my business should be very strong such that I'm able to again attract capital after 2.5 years, which will take and complete my journey to the 1,000 crores. So I think a very long answer and a complicated answer to a simple question. Sorry.
Thanks, Parita. And thank you everyone for your participation in this session. I hope you all enjoyed this session, and thanks to Parita, of course, for this wonderful, insightful, conversation that we had. I would like to hand it over to Diksha for the closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Praita, for such an insightful session. I am certain everyone in the room is walking away with something valuable. And Pariti, thank you so much for holding the conversation so well. The Wimpy Career WhatsApp link is there in the chat box. If you haven't joined, then please do join, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session.
Thank you so much, Diksha and Pratiti. Thank you, everybody who dialed in. I hope it was useful. And please feel free to reach out to any of us whenever you think you want to bounce off something.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.